reason I've chosen to go with video games in history is just because it's a new field and a new technology, which, well, I'll say new, it's been around since the 1970s, but particularly in recent decades, we've been seeing an increase in history in the field. Now, some of you might be wondering, like, well, exactly just how big are video games getting and why does this warrant our attention? So, in terms of just the cultural impact, in Australia alone, roughly 67% of the population play, with also budget and scale very quickly outstripping cinema. So in 2014, Destiny hit a $500 million US budget that outstrips pretty much most movies out there. This includes development costs, marketing, and as a result, the title was a bit of a notorious flop in a way, but still a huge success, but budgets-wise. And also, I'm guessing if I asked if some of you in here have played Grand Theft Auto 5, a couple of you probably raise your hands. In the first week, that game made $1 billion US in sales, and in the years since, that's hit $6 billion. So this is a medium which is very, very quickly finding its way into our homes, telling us narratives and spreading us messages. So if we're not paying attention to it, we do risk things going quite wrong. So this also led me to a bit of an issue of just where do I start with this topic? Because one thing which hit me very, very quickly was that you could write a doctoral thesis on all the ways that you could take this, and I don't have time, you don't have time, and I'm pretty sure all of you would like to go to bed soon. So just with a couple of things we quickly hit is just, of course, to actually really take a look at this properly, it does require an intersectional approach and really requires a multidisciplinary approach, because you're not just looking at history, you're looking at sociology, you're looking at cultural stuff. There's a whole bunch of areas which we need to touch on. Also, public discourse around this is, as I put on the slideshow there, it's caustic to put it mildly. This is because a lot of online gaming culture is notoriously toxic. I don't know if the words Anita Sarkeesian mean anything to anyone in here, but if you want to find out just how bad some of these guys can get, that, or just looking at the words Gamergate, and it is a depressing spiral, and which, even though it happened in 2014, we are still feeling the cultural impact of today. Now, also, academically speaking, the discourse of this was limited mostly to World War II materials that I found. So, pretty much in the early 2000s, for those who don't know, there was a big boom in World War II shooters following the release of Medal of Honor. There was a small response by historians to kind of study this, but then that very quickly fizzled out. So, just as a very, very brief history of historical games and computer, they're pretty much as old as the home computer. I need to emphasize that, not game consoles, not computing in general, the home computer. This is largely just due to the exposure of basically home computing, and particularly the microcomputer, if that phrase means anything to anyone in this room. Now, this is largely due because a lot of these home computers would actually have a higher cost of entry, or a very, very new technology to have in the home, and actually had quite a high level of entry. This gives us that very nerdy perception of the hobby. And as a result, you see a lot of things. So for example, just the example I've used here is one called Defenders of the Crown, which is an old title where you're effectively trying to dominate what is now the United Kingdom. As time's moved on, they've gotten somewhat mainstreamed, moved into the console space a little bit, with things like Assassin's Creed hitting mainstream success. However, again, I kind of need to emphasize that in terms of that mainstream success, this is still only a little bit. There's only kind of a few games in that area which have hit that level of success. Now, as a result, that means that a lot of the titles that we're working with, they've hit a much smaller but very intense demographic, particularly in the PC scene, with much more kind of geeky titles such as War Thunder, Rising Storm, and Europa Universalis. And then, of course, there are some exceptions in general to the mainstreaming bit to do with like Civilization and Age of Empires, if those ring a bell for anyone. But again, like this is what we're currently at. It's mostly this mid-tier, but this mid-tier is still really important because you have thousands of people playing these every single day. Okay, so this kind of brought me to my first big issue, and this is something which is not just in historical games, but games in general, is that a lot of them are preoccupied with violence as a mechanic. This is in part to do with how programmers view the interaction of violence. If any of you are familiar with an if-then statement, that basically, if I was to put that in terms of like game code, if punch, then enemy takes damage. If health equals 0, then enemy die. Just really basic, and that's very simple for programmers to do. Of course, there's still a lot of minutiae within that, but it's considered a very simple interaction. Now, there are things like puzzle racing, which do have their own subgenres, but they're not really hitting the major successes that we're seeing outside of a few small titles. Like, you probably all played Tetris at some point, but that is very much the exception to the rule. One thing which doesn't help as well is that, of course, something which I think, again, everyone's going to be very familiar with is this perception of video games as a boys' hobby, which, yeah, look, statistically speaking, this has been proven more and more wrong as time has moved on. When I was looking up stats, the stat which I came up to was on average a 55-45 split over the last 10 years, so 55% male players, 45% female. And a lot of this is due to the rebranding of video games as boys' toys in the 1980s, particularly following the 1983 market crash in the States. So, and again, this also comes into a whole lot of other stuff. So as I said, when I said intersectional, so we're touching on feminist theory here, you know, toxic masculinity, a bunch of other things. Also, very sorry for speaking very quickly for anyone. I'm catching on to that, it's just I've got a lot of ground to cover. Okay, so, and another, and as I said, a result of this sort of culture of violence in games and games being largely based around violence is that it's also made it very hard for games with history to feature more complex mechanics featuring sociological, cultural, or any other sort of interaction outside of just straight violence. And one thing which it doesn't help as well is that when we start to get into these more complex simulator type games or ones which may have more complex interactions, you have this issue of branching complexity. And the example I've pulled here is from a title called Alpha Protocol. So I can actually make this available, sorry, there's links embedded, where it took some developers approximately 2 months to program a single conversation just to account for all of the checks, balances, stats, everything that had to go in, and all the optional outcomes. Whereas again, so you see, you talk about all those optional outcomes versus if punch bad guy fall down. So you can see why there's that sort of incentive programming-wise to make something simpler, more manageable, and a lot less complicated. So it does also result in, we do still have studios which have tried this, but again, they aren't the biggest games, they also sometimes aren't the most successful, but with some exceptions. So for example, SimCity, City Skylines, Banished, and The Sims. These ones all hit some level of success, but for every success, there are 100 ones that have fallen flat. So yeah, that's another issue. Like, because of that complexity, there is very much an incentive towards that simplistic violence. Now, as a quick question here as well, just to everyone, we just want to look at like exactly who the developers are and exactly who are making these games, because this does play into how these are being perceived. For the large part, it's still a historically very white male-dominated area. In fact, some of you may have heard in the news, companies like Blizzard, Riot, Ubisoft, all getting into a lot of legal trouble. I'm talking tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in lawsuits and workers walking out kind of trouble over the behavior. However, this has also been changing in recent years with the increase of people of color, women, trans people, non-binary people, and just an abundance of variety of people entering the space. And one of the big issues here is here as well is that this bro culture tends to not really account for diverse thinking and diverse perspectives when it comes to approaching history. Now, as well as that, I think it feels really important to note is the geographic location of most of these developers, with most large developers being in large built-up economies. Here in Australia, we used to have one before the 2008 financial crash. Of course, United States, Canada, across several areas of Europe. So again, it's this very, very centralized, very westernized kind of view, with only some recent breaks into Eastern Europe kind of being the exception there, particularly again in the PC market. Now, this image on the here, yep, that very nicely explains exactly what I've run into many times. So a lot of these people are designers first and amateur hobbyists, historians secondary. So occasionally outside academics are brought in, but again, very, very occasionally. And as a result, they're very largely influenced by pop history, which has to be very conservative, very nationalistic, and sometimes not very well researched. And as well as that, they're also very much influenced by film. So if the names Gods and Generals or 1492 Conquest of Paradise mean anything to anyone, you'll know what I mean when I'm talking about that kind of media. It also has a very high crossover with historical reenactor, wargaming, and online amateur communities. And as this meme points out, those communities have problems. I'm just going to put it as problems and leave this to fill in the gap. Alright, so this perspective as well has a number of issues in that it tends to really focus heavily on military and material culture. So it's really, really obsessed with like getting the minutiae right, like, oh, is the firing lever on the AK-47 in the correct position to be firing fully automatic, as opposed to like, well, is this Vietnamese soldier in the jungle doing this because he's trying to find a better way for his family, or is it just going to be broadened out as broadly communism, whatever? And as a result, because they're so hyper-focused on the material culture, a lot of the really, really important historical narratives have been left behind, and it also creates this sort of interesting gap for them where, because they're so focused on the minutiae, it also tends to leave out the lived experience of this material culture. So I know one which came to mind recently is a really great video on it online about the T-34 tank, where a whole bunch of people focus on it, it's like, oh, this great, brilliant tank. Then you read Russians who actually drove the thing, and my god, they hated it because it's cramped, it's hot, and they cheaped out. Like, they're trying to get as much as they can, it's horrible in there. But to a lot of people who've only been playing games or in this very amateur history, all that they're seeing is, oh, look at the stats of it, look at its gun, look at this, look at that. And again, it creates this very problematic view of history where they're not actually seeing it as a complex set of cultural influences, of politics, of people. They're seeing it purely as stats, almost as a card game. And in fact, the card game up there is actually real. If some of you are familiar with Top Trumps, like that card game that goes around, that was from their World of Tanks series, where they kind of literally just stuck numbers to the tanks. And one of the big issues of this as well is that the pitfalls of this perspective means that they often don't have the knowledge to really go about why certain memes or jokes may be problematic. So, for example, I played a lot of Rising Storm 2 Vietnam, and I've heard so many horrible Vietnamese accents, which I spent 7 years of my life working for a Vietnamese family, and like, I dare not repeat some of the crap I've had said in those servers to any of them. But also, for example, just some common ones, so Dana's Walt, that was actually been shaking me, I had to cut that, otherwise I might just need an epileptic seizure. Hans gets a Flammenwerfer, which, look, I get kind of funny, but also still a Nazi. And then, of course, Titus gets the cross, that, you know, sort of dealing with the fact that Rome is a slave, was a slave state. And as a result as well, because they have this very simplified view of it, they're not viewing these societies in a very, in a very complicated manner. So again, Rome is viewed as the epitome of masculinity as opposed to this complicated state full of complex and interesting people. For example, like your speech, your talk before about, you know, Roman poetry, for example, they wouldn't even consider that. It's, well, is the length of the gladius correct? So this perspective has a number of knock-on effects. One of which is that it's created a very welcoming space for historical disinformation, but also this disinformation also has a bit of a problem of then leading people down some pretty dark paths. Like before that meme with like the Sig Heil Nazi and then standing for me just looking utterly confused and slightly terrified. I'm saying mostly terrified, let's be real. So it's created this way where people can actually insert historical disinformation to then suit a certain political narrative. And look, if you want to see this taken to an extreme, all you have to do is turn on the news right now and look at Russian justifications for Ukraine, where we've seen this exact thing being done, but done by a state. But this can also be done by this can also be done by bad actors. And in fact, a lot of these video games are pretty notorious for recruiting to what's called the alt-right pipeline, which pretty much fed young men to the alt-right for quite a long period, like particularly from 2014 to 2016. So Gamergate to the election of Trump being two kind of big events for that recruiting. And these games played a pretty key role in getting them thinking this way, because again, they're not viewing history as complicated events for people, they're viewing it as, you know, does the M16 forward receiver actually go forward, or did they pull it like in Counter-Strike? So just as a very short list of examples, and Rick, I just want to preface by saying, if anyone who plays these and enjoys these, you're not a bad person, they're fun games, it's just this is a problem which is pretty inherent to their perspective. But you'll find these also, these are actually pretty common in Steam as well, so Rising Storm 2 Vietnam, Verdun, Tannenberg, Enlisted, War Thunder, World of Tanks, Planes/Warships, Hell Let Loose, Beyond the Wire, Mordhau Mountain Blade, and there is an incredible long list after this. Yeah, so as I said, these are very often disinterested in politics and the narratives, and again, very much so into the minutiae, which, as we talked before, leads to a lot of troubling places when it comes to trying to educate the public about history. And then, okay, I'm just gonna let you read that. Yeah, and I saw that and I just, who thought that was okay? And why? Okay, anyhow, sorry. But there's still hope. There is still some hope. Some titles have actually tried to at least work more towards the basis of historicity as opposed to strict historical accuracy. So they'll have a number of other things maybe a bit inaccurate, but they are trying to get the broad conceptions of the time correct, whether that be the lived experiences, themes, people, or even just representation right. So Bioshock Infinite, which even though it is a steampunk piece, is actually, it tries to explore pretty much turn of the century Americana in a pretty interesting and fascinating way, including by touching a lot of the politics, which people may not even realize unless they've been exposed to it or thought about it directly. So Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which actually allowed players to have an openly same-sex relationship in ancient Greece, which also led to this very, very funny tweet of someone who's very, very misinformed getting very publicly corrected. I know that this went around, I think it was around Modern History Society's Facebook a bit as well at the time, and I know the ancient history one as well. And then one which I have spent way too much time in, please don't judge me, I'm definitely playing this when I get home because I have problems. Hunt Showdown, which is set in Louisiana in 1895. So of course this is a period and a place full of problems, we'll put it that way. But the developers have actually opted to allow players to inhabit ethnically diverse hunters and people of both male and female. Or of course, they haven't actually touched on more queer representation yet. Which I should note that for old Western settings, that is actually pretty unique because even all the Western games, it's still your Red Dead Redemption with a white male lead. So having this was actually a surprising change even when I jumped into it, and it's actually something which I know a lot of people tend to get very into as they're playing. So basically, in summation, we have this really focus on historical accuracy, which tends to be just skin deep. It really neglects the actual lived experiences and actual problems that people, what people have faced or what history is, like. As I mentioned, again, the issue of the propagation of misinformation, and then also how this is then used to pipe on to more extreme views. And I'd just like to thank everyone for listening, the Society of Humans opportunity to talk, and also my cat Suki, who listened to this speech way too many times over and didn't try to kill me. If anyone that's interested, I have photos of her looking like a wet rat from yesterday when I gave her a bath. Just hit me up. But yeah. Alright, thank you all very, very much. Any questions? I don't think it's particularly effective because when you actually look at the stats of players who are reading that material, it's often very small, and most of this information has been communicated directly through the gameplay itself. And in fact, I've actually really got examples of teaching using even entirely fictionalized games. So for example, a lot of people who play video games are familiar with what the Masamune is, which is a sort of Japanese legend, through video games, because it was actually brought up as a plot point in Final Fantasy VII. Whereas, if you have this big block in a codex to read, a lot of players will zone out, kind of go past it, because that's not what they're there for. Anyone else? Yep.
And do forgive me, because there's a lot of generalizations that I'm going to need to make for this.
Yep, go for it.
But you mentioned early on that video games, and I personally experience this, I do play video games myself, is more of a man's world.
Mm-hmm.
Even today, even though it is changing. But you mentioned something more of the more popular games, for example, Grand Theft Auto is more focused on violence. That's very like if HP 0 then KO. It's a little bit more simplistic. And then you mentioned the Sims afterwards as one of those games that has a little bit more variability to it. And I'm not sure if anyone else here plays video games, but I've noticed that The Sims is a girls' game.
Yeah.
It's not a real video game. And I'm wondering if you some sort of correlation between this kind of simplicity, boys, violence, and then women are pushed more towards social settings with consequences if you're mean and try to kill people because there are mods for that in The Sims.
What do you mean mods? Just take out lava from the pool.
True. But I'm wondering if you think there's any sort of correlation between that.
I to that point, or even games that are more targeted to women with violence are more like softer violence. I mean, talking now the rise of Minecraft and kind of that rise of like female MCYT content and everything. It's still women playing games, but it's still that kind of less violent game.
So this is definitely something which I have noted, because in particular, as you mentioned, it's all like that, because a little the softer, the more gentler. Women want and it's one of those things which, at least from my understanding, when it comes to actually playing reality, The Sims does actually have a huge male player base, but because the culture of gaming is so toxic, and particularly just, again, I have to turn this toxic masculinity here, because that is what we are seeing, basically writ large in a place where a lot of men feel they're not going to be criticised for doing it. They will then actively, push that view. I think another great example is Animal Crossing, which again has a whole bunch of people playing it, both men and women, but gets stereotyped being women because you're making a village and you're making friends, and but at the same time, people of just various backgrounds still find it entertaining, and it's something which I think that for gaming is needing to move forward, not just in history but for everything, does need to let go of, because the reality is people enjoy all different kinds of interactions. It's just a matter of actually giving them the option for those interactions and saying, hey, this is enjoyable, as opposed to just saying, okay boys, here's GTA, girls, here's The Sims, don't go between it. Even though, look, I have seen plenty of women GTA players who just have as much of a foul mouth as the 12-year-old boys, so, take it as you will. Okay. Yep.
Could you even attribute it to a mechanics issue as well, of that kind of more female gamer base is the simpler games like The Sims, or it's like point and click, or I'm at the moment trying to pick up The Witcher 3 from completely playing The Sims, where it's just...
Please help me, I'm simping over Geralt still to this day. Come on. Why do you do this to me?
And that kind of, again, that male versus female sense of the simplicity of how the game's actually played. Again, I raise Minecraft of it's a couple buttons.
Yeah, and most definitely. I think, again, so as we were touching on before, so there's this view of like the kind of interaction women want, but also presenting the female games as simpler. And again, there's a lot of perception amongst men, and as I was talking about before, particularly with male developers, because something they really emphasize is that a lot of the development space is still male, where it is growing in terms of diversity. This is a decades-long culture. Women were pushed out of this space in the 1980s during that anti-feminist backlash of the Reagan years, or Reagan and Thatcher, and just that is a different talk for a different day. But yeah, so as a result, you have a lot of men who aren't thinking of women as thinking people who enjoy a variety of things, but instead it's like, well, I know women, I have a wife or a girlfriend or a mother, and she enjoys the mobile games, so I'm going to do that for her.
Just adding to it, as a colour players games, I really feel like games are very much steered to white, cisgender men. Even when the portrayal of coloured people in the games, you say how the cards and the stats, you always find the colour, if there's a colour nation, they obviously have the lowest stat in the game, and try to build a nation through those names. So I know Nick, right? What was the game European Universalist, and you're trying to play as Indigenous Australia, and it just takes
Yeah. I was taking out my anger at doing an essay on colonialism by playing as one of the Camilla on it. I'm just trying to conquer all of Asia and then get back to London and burn it down.
Okay, look, it makes you feel better. When I was doing a third-year project about this topic, I actually chose Total War Rome 2 as one of my examples. I couldn't help myself. I set my objective as burn Carthage. I couldn't help it. I was successful. I did do some self-reflecting afterwards. Still burn Carthage, can't find Linda Est, but
just continuing as well, and even if a game chooses to do a non-white setting, say Total War, they obviously just go to Japan or China, just because that's what kids white cisgender men had grown up in the 90s watching kung fu movies and samurai movies, and you never see any variety
Actually, I think it's really, oh, sorry, I'll get to it in just a second. I think it's actually a really great point to bring up as well, because a lot of the diversity comes from that kind of, it's a very artificial in a lot of ways. Well, it's still pulling from stereotypes, and like even when developers are well intended, they often tend to fall into this trap. Like, I don't know if any of you played Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Like, I picked that up recently, and one thing which occurred to me is, okay, one of the main villains is obviously of South Asian descent, and the lead character is a white dude. But the reality of the story of the game is you could have switched that around entirely, would not have mattered, but the developers still went with that decision, and it kind of makes you question, well, why did you pick that way around? Like, why did you default to the white male as the lead character? Because again, their stories really have nothing to do with their gender, so it just seems very artificial. And they are trying to include diversity by having her, but then also considering the role of putting her as a villain rather than in a heroic position. I'm sorry.
Yeah, first of all, I think absolutely great speech. That meme from Peep Show sums up. I've played it. I'm a big flight simulator, and it's the same thing. You have people in those communities who can tell you some insane mechanical stuff that goes completely beyond me, and I'm still like, alright, this is fun. But the actual question, I guess, as a historian and someone who plays games, what do you know? Is there anything in your experience? Is there a way to effectively kind of push back that you know? Like, it's obviously a huge problem, and asking anyone to come up with solutions is kind of like a bit of an arsehole move. But like, in your experience, I guess, is there anything that you've seen that can counter that, or?
Well, first of all, I'd say that for as many toxic, abusive dickheads as there are online, pushing back and actively criticizing these things does need to happen. That's something which just doesn't happen near enough. A lot of the communities built around these games are very, they're very isolated. They only hear the narratives that community wants to hear. A lot of the time, that narrative is, just to pull from Rising Storm again, America good, communism bad. And as you can imagine, that kind of creates an echo chamber. So I think one of the first big steps that we can take is to actively create content aimed towards these people to actually try and counter that particular narrative. Moving forward, the reality here is I think that none of these are going to be simple, overnight fixes. It's going to be long-term systemic changes, including as towards how we educate people in history. I mean, I know I've worked as a high school tutor, and I've seen some improvements over the years, but I still remember going to school and it was Anzacs. What other history? Shut up, Anzacs. So, this will happen over time, but it's something I think we can help influence. But it's going to be by getting more involved in these communities with developers, actually touching base and engaging with developers to try and make things not just accurate in terms of how long is the sword, but why that sword is being used in the first place. Anyone else? Yeah. So ancient mythology, I do think very much has a place because, of course, as ancient mythology gets interpreted and reinterpreted, it does very much so reflect the time in which it's being made. So I think it's God of War coming out shortly, shortly after 9/11, in a very macho, aggressive, masculine world. Very telling of its time. So it's something where I think mythology does need to be examined as a part of this great corpus of historical work. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I'm referring to the original back in, I think it was 2003?
Yeah, I like your point about reflecting the timeline because you see the modern one.
Yeah, Kratos going through a massive change, his own sense of masculinity actually in question, and including how he's also raising Atreus to not make the same mistakes that he did.
So you're going to say it's like she fucking so much like versioning everything
Yeah, as a result, you actually start seeing some of that actually knocking back, where you have some developers who are more open-minded, taking things in.
I try to put games alongside more respected literature.
Yeah. Alright, so Nick's standing up, and I'm pretty sure for my best attempt I did go over time. Really, really sorry, I tried.